14 goats stood behind a temporary fence on a Tuesday morning in April, and Caleb Mercer stood beside them, looking at 52 acres that a dozen farmers before him had already decided weren't worth saving. From the county road outside Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, the property barely read as farmland at all. Blackberry canes had swallowed whole sections of the old fence line until the wire disappeared beneath them. Young cedar had crowded into what used to be open pasture. In places, the weeds stood tall enough to hide a grown man from the shoulders down. The previous owners had stopped fighting it years earlier, and by the time the county put it up for auction, most of Cedar Hollow had stopped calling it a farm at all. People just called it the dead acres, the way you'd name a pothole or a bad stretch of road. A fact of the landscape, nothing more. Caleb was 37, and he hadn't come looking for a bargain out of pure practicality. He'd come because of his father. Wendell Mercer had farmed 40 acres 2 counties over until Caleb was 11, until 3 bad years in a row and a bank that had stopped extending patience finally took it from him at auction. Caleb still remembered that morning with a clarity that surprised him, given how young he'd been. The auctioneer had set up folding chairs in the front yard, close enough to the porch that Caleb could see his mother standing in the doorway, unwilling to come out and watch, but unable to stay fully inside either. His father stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing, while a banker Caleb had met exactly once read out terms in a flat, procedural voice that made the whole thing sound like paperwork instead of what it actually was. When the gavel came down on a number lower than what the equipment alone had been worth 2 years earlier, Caleb watched his father's jaw work once, hard, and then go still. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for more time. He just watched 40 acres change hands to a man from 3 counties over who'd won it for hunting leases, and then he drove his family home in a truck that would, within the year, become the only vehicle he had left to his name. Wendell never farmed again after that. He drove a feed truck for the next 20 years, delivering to men who still owned the kind of land he'd lost, and some nights, when he thought Caleb wasn't listening, he'd say the same thing to no one in particular, that the land didn't die when a bank took it. It just waited on somebody patient enough to come back and remember it. Wendell died 4 years ago without ever getting land back. Caleb had spent every year since with that unfinished sentence sitting in his chest, and when the county auction listing came up for 52 acres nobody wanted, cheap enough that a man with a small herd and a beat-up truck could actually afford it, he didn't see weeds. He saw a chance to finish something his father never got to. He drove out to tell his mother before he signed anything, mostly because some part of him needed to hear whether the idea sounded as reasonable out loud as it did in his head. She listened at her kitchen table, the same table Caleb had grown up doing homework at while his father worked late shifts on the feed truck, and when he finished, she was quiet long enough that he started to doubt himself. "Your father would have told you it's a fool's errand," she finally said. "He'd have also been the first one out there helping you clear it. So I suppose that tells you what his opinion was actually worth." She reached across the table and took Caleb's hand, the way she used to when he was young enough to need reassuring after a bad day. "I just don't want you carrying his disappointment like it's yours to fix. That land he lost, that wasn't your failure, Caleb. You don't owe anybody proof." "I know," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it yet. "I'm not doing this to fix what happened to him. I just don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have done something he never got the chance to." She didn't argue with that. She just squeezed his hand once and told him to be careful with his back, the way mothers do when they've decided a conversation about grief has gone about as far as it usefully can for one afternoon. He didn't say any of that to Ray Dillard, who caught him outside the feed store the week after the auction closed, 2 other farmers standing nearby pretending not to listen. "You're buying weeds, Caleb." Ray leaned against his own truck, arms crossed, watching Caleb load a coil of fencing wire. "There ain't a farm under there anymore." "I don't need the weeds," Caleb said. "I need what's underneath them." Ray laughed, short and genuine, the kind of laugh a man gives when he's not trying to be cruel, just can't help himself. One of the other men shook his head and looked off toward the hills. Caleb let it go. He'd learned a long time ago, watching his father explain himself to bankers who'd already made up their minds, that some ideas got weaker every time you tried to defend them out loud. Better to just do the work and let the land argue for you. 3 mornings later, he brought the goats. The temporary fencing took most of the first morning. The old perimeter was too tangled to trust, and Caleb had to cut through sections by hand before the electric netting would hold. The goats were restless in the trailer the whole time, calling to each other, and when he finally opened the gate they went in cautious, sniffing at brush, deciding what interested them, while Caleb stood at the fence with the specific discomfort of a man about to find out whether an idea that made sense in his head made any sense at all in the world. For a while, nothing much happened. The goats picked at scattered leaves. A few younger ones wandered toward the open ground where grazing was easiest. Then one of the older does reached a blackberry cane, caught it between her teeth, and pulled until the thorn stem bent down to her. And another goat moved for a cedar sapling and started stripping bark from the low branches. Then another. Within 20 minutes the whole herd was working. It wasn't dramatic. No walls of vegetation collapsed. No acre of clean pasture appeared before his eyes. But narrow paths began opening through the brush, thin lines where the goats had passed, and by the time the afternoon heat drove Caleb back to his truck, he understood that the method might actually hold, if he had the patience for it. The first week tested exactly that. His forearms were shredded from thorns by Wednesday. His boots never fully dried, soaked through every morning by dew that hadn't burned off before he was already out checking fence. Twice he chased goats through gaps in the fencing where they'd wandered toward the neighbor's grass. Apparently more interesting than the weeds he'd paid good money to bring them there for. He learned the particular exhaustion of physical work that produces no visible result. Clearing brush for 8 hours and driving home past the same tangled fence line that had looked exactly the same that morning, the kind of work that tests a man's belief in a plan more than it tests his body. He was still working his day job those first months, framing houses 2 towns over, which meant the goats and the land got whatever hours were left after a full shift. Early mornings before the crew call, evenings until the light gave out, weekends entirely. His savings, modest to begin with, went into fencing supplies, feed to supplement what the goats couldn't yet find on their own, and the truck payment that didn't care whether the land was cooperating or not. By the 5th week, he sat at his kitchen table with the numbers spread out in front of him the way his father must have, once, at a table very much like it, and understood for the first time just how thin the margin actually was between an idea that worked and one that quietly bankrupted the person trying it. He didn't quit. He cut back on things that didn't matter, ate simpler, drove less, sold a spare set of tools he wasn't using, and kept the goats fed and the fencing maintained. Because the alternative was becoming a story people in Cedar Hollow told about a man who'd almost proven something. The scare came in the 6th week, before he'd found anything beyond brush and blistered hands. One of the younger does went off her feed overnight, stood apart from the herd with her head low, and by the time Caleb noticed something was wrong, she was too weak to stand without help. He called the only large animal vet within 40 minutes, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Okafor who arrived a little past dark and worked by truck headlights, drawing blood, checking the doe's gums, asking Caleb question after question about what exactly the herd had been eating. "Goats will try anything once," she told him, packing her kit back into the truck once the doe was stable enough to leave. "Somewhere on that property there's something that shouldn't be in a goat's mouth. Could be nightshade, could be something ornamental somebody planted decades ago and forgot about. You're going to need to walk every foot of ground they're working before you turn them loose on a new section, or you're going to lose one for real next time." It meant slowing everything down. For the next several days, before moving the herd into fresh brush, Caleb walked the ground himself first, on his knees some mornings, checking every unfamiliar plant against a guide he'd bought at the feed store, cutting out anything he couldn't positively identify before letting the goats near it. It cost him time he didn't feel like he had. It also, without his fully realizing it yet, taught him to read the ground in a level of detail he wouldn't otherwise have developed, the same close attention that would matter, weeks later, when a shovel first struck stone instead of soil. The doe recovered within a week. Caleb never did find the exact plant that had made her sick, but he found plenty else walking that ground on his knees looking for it. Ray slowed his truck at the fence that Friday. "You making any progress?" "Some." Ray looked past him at the property. "Looks exactly the same to me." "Give it time," Caleb said, and Ray shook his head and drove on, and the exchange stuck with Caleb longer than he wanted to admit, because Ray wasn't wrong. From the road, nothing had visibly changed. What Ray couldn't see from the road was that the goats had started exposing the actual shape of the ground beneath the vegetation. And that was about to lead Caleb towards something nobody in Cedar Hollow remembered was there at all. By the second week, the goats had taught him something the county records never could. Every section of that property behaved differently, and the places where the herd lingered told him more than the places they ignored. One morning, moving the animals along what he'd assumed was just an old fence line, Caleb noticed the posts didn't run straight the way a boundary fence should. They curved gently around a shallow depression, disappeared into growth, and picked up again farther uphill, as if whoever set those posts had been following the shape of something instead of simply dividing one field from the next. He pushed into the brush and started clearing by hand. His shovel struck something that didn't sound like soil. Stone. Fitted stone, laid with a care that ruled out coincidence. A channel, continuing downhill in a steady, deliberate grade, the soil around it darker and damp even after weeks without rain. Someone had built this to move water. He kept searching, found another stretch of the same stone a few yards on. Then, clearing brush around an old cedar near the property's center, his shovel struck something that rang instead of thudded. Metal, buried deep enough that it had clearly been down there a long time. He worked around the roots until a small rusted tin box came free. The hinge nearly crumbled when he opened it. Inside, most of the papers had rotted past reading, but one sheet had survived. A hand-drawn map of the property, the lines rough but deliberate, following the same route as the stone channel he'd already found. Near the center, someone had sketched a small rectangle beside a series of lines meant to represent water. One word remained legible beneath it, faded almost to nothing. House. Caleb stood there a long moment, listening to goats moving somewhere past the cedars, and understood that the question he'd been trying to answer, could goats actually clear 52 acres, had just been replaced by a different one entirely. What were they clearing the way toward? By the third week, Caleb had stopped treating the property like one enormous problem. Every section had its own rhythm, and the more the goats opened up, the more the old channels and fence lines made sense as parts of something rather than accidents. He kept the map in a plastic sleeve under the truck seat, pulling it out whenever the ground in front of him seemed to match a line on the paper. The old farm had been built around water. That much was becoming clear. One Saturday, working a section near the center of the acreage, he noticed flat stones extending away from the channel, deliberate, unlike the scattered rock everywhere else. He followed them uphill, cutting through a wall of vines with loppers, patient enough not to disturb whatever was underneath. The loppers struck something solid. He cleared enough vine to see it plainly, a stone wall. Not a fence, not a drainage feature, a foundation. He went back to the truck, spread the map across the hood, and compared the faded rectangle to the stones in front of him. The map had been right. There had been a house here, not a shed, not a shelter for livestock. A farmhouse. Over the following days the goats cleared enough around it for Caleb to find a section of stone walkway, an iron hinge gone orange with rust, weathered pieces of timber, the remains of a chimney standing at one corner of the foundation. He took photographs. Then he drove to the county records office first, on the assumption that a farmhouse foundation ought to leave some kind of paper trail behind it. It didn't, not the way he'd hoped. The clerk on duty, a patient young man named Wesley, pulled every deed transfer he could find for the parcel going back to the 1940s, and the ownership chain was clear enough on paper. Names, dates, sale prices, but none of it described what had actually stood on the land or when it had stopped standing. Deeds tell you who owned it, Wesley said, sliding the folder across the counter. They don't tell you what it looked like while they had it. For that you'd want somebody who actually remembers, and there's not many of those left for a property this old. He gave Caleb one name before he left, an elderly woman 2 streets over who'd lived in Cedar Hollow her whole life, and had, according to Wesley, opinions about every piece of ground in this county going back further than the courthouse records do. That was how Caleb ended up on Delia Mercer's porch 3 days later. Delia Mercer, no relation to Caleb, as far as either of them could tell, though the coincidence made her smile when he mentioned it, was 91, sharp-eyed, sitting near her front window with a cardigan over her shoulders despite the warm afternoon, and when he described the foundation, she didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the way people do when they're deciding whether a memory is worth the trouble of pulling back out. You mean the Whitaker place? Caleb felt something shift in his chest at a name he'd never once heard before that moment. I don't know whose place it was. That's why I'm here. Well, sit down then. She gestured to the chair across from her. My father worked alongside Ezra Whitaker most of his life. I was a girl the last time I saw that farm running, but I remember it plain enough. She described it slowly, filling in details as they came back to her. Apple trees running in rows down the slope behind the house. A garden that never seemed to want for water even in years when everyone else's did. A spring the Whitakers had learned to move through the land by hand, channeled stone by stone the way her father used to talk about with something close to reverence. Ezra used to say the land would tell you what it needed, if you were patient enough to listen instead of forcing it. My father thought that was the smartest thing he'd ever heard a farmer say. What happened to them? Delia's expression softened into something sadder. Same thing that happens to a lot of families out here, eventually. A bad decade, a death in the family, children who didn't want to stay and fight for ground that hard. They sold up sometime in the 60s, best I remember, and whoever bought it after never understood what they had. Let the channels silt in. Let the orchard go wild. Give a piece of land like that one generation of neglect, and it starts hiding what it used to be. Give it two, and most folks forget it was ever anything different. It disappeared, Delia said, folding her hands in her lap. But the land didn't forget what had been done to it. Ground remembers longer than people do, young man. That's the part everybody gets backward. Caleb thought about that the whole drive back. He'd spent weeks believing he was clearing land. He understood now he was uncovering the remains of a farm that had been forgotten, not destroyed, and the difference mattered more than he could yet explain. The orchard came next. Mature trees, spaced too evenly to be accidental, buried under a decade of vines and dead growth that made them look, from a distance, like nothing more than overgrown scrub. Caleb cleared around the first trunk, then the next, working with a hand-pruning saw because he was afraid of what a chainsaw might take off along with the vines. And by the time he stepped back, the pattern was unmistakable. Rows, stretching farther downhill than he'd first realized, spaced with the deliberate evenness that only comes from someone who'd planned an orchard on paper before ever putting a single tree in the ground. An orchard, damaged, half of it dead, the surviving trees stunted and crowded, but alive enough in places to prove exactly what Delia had told him. He started working more carefully after that. Not simply clearing whatever stood in the way, but marking sections where the old layout might still survive underneath, cutting vines by hand around the surviving trees, instead of letting the goats strip everything at once, since a goat wouldn't know the difference between a 100-year-old apple tree worth saving and a volunteer sapling worth clearing. The work slowed. It also started meaning something different. Every stone, every depression, every surviving root seemed to belong to a design he was only beginning to understand. He found where the orchard connected to the channels, followed the main line farther than before, and discovered it split, one branch continuing toward what had likely been a garden. Water from higher ground, carried exactly where it was needed, the farmhouse built beside the system rather than apart from it. He didn't have the whole picture yet, but he had enough to know there was a whole picture to find. It was around this time that Ray started stopping by more than he strictly needed to. He never said he'd changed his mind. Pride wouldn't allow him that directly, but he'd pull over at the fence some evenings on his way home, ask a question or two about the fencing setup, and once, without much comment, drop off a spool of wire he said he had extra of anyway. Though Caleb never once saw Ray's own fencing in need of repair. It wasn't belief yet. It was something smaller and more honest. The beginning of a man deciding he'd rather be wrong quietly than right loudly. One afternoon Ray came by, and, for the first time, got out of his truck. He stood at the fence a long while, looking first at the exposed foundation, then the orchard, then the channel disappearing under grass. "You actually found something," he finally said. "I found a lot more than I expected." Ray was quiet a moment, looking out at the exposed foundation like he was seeing something underneath it that wasn't quite the stone itself. "My grandfather used to take me fishing up past here when I was a kid," he finally said. "There was a spot on the drive where he'd always slow the truck down, look off toward these hills, and go quiet a minute. Never explained why. I asked him once, and he just said, there was a farm through there way back. Best ground in the valley, till it wasn't anybody's anymore. I was maybe 9. Didn't think much of it. Kids don't, about things that happened before they existed. He shook his head slowly. Never once connected that to this particular 52 acres. Why would I? Nothing here looked like anybody's best ground. When Caleb asked if he thought his grandfather meant the Whitakers, Ray nodded slowly. Could have been. He looked toward the foundation one more time. Maybe there was a farm under there after all. He didn't stay to celebrate it. He got back in his truck and drove off, and Caleb didn't call after him, because there was still too much ground left uncovered for a small moment like that to mean much yet. By early autumn, the shape of the old farm had become visible enough that Caleb didn't need the map at every step anymore. The orchard stood in recognizable rows. The channels ran clear through most of the property. The farmhouse was still only stone and a chimney, but it no longer read as ruin. It read as something waking back up. Then, in late October, the rain came. The forecast had called for heavy weather, and Cedar Hollow had seen heavy weather before, so Caleb didn't think much of it at first. He moved the goats to higher ground, checked the fence around the orchard, cleared debris from the lower channels, and went home for the night trusting the system he'd uncovered to handle exactly the kind of storm it had clearly been built to handle. By morning, the ground was saturated enough that water ran downhill in open sheets. He drove out early and found the upper channel carrying a strong, healthy flow exactly as it should, but lower down, water was pooling where it had no business pooling. He followed it and found the problem. A section of the old stone wall had given way under the pressure, spilling water across ground that had no channel to catch it. With the soil already soaked through, a few more hours of rain could turn a fixable problem into something much worse. He spent that whole day fighting it, moving stone by hand, clearing mud, opening a secondary channel farther downhill, using whatever he had in the truck bed to slow the flow before it reached the orchard. Every repair exposed another weak point. By afternoon, part of the orchard stood in standing water. Several of the younger trees he'd spent months nursing back had begun to lean, and a stretch of fence had gone down completely, forcing him to move the goats yet again. He stood in the mud looking at all of it, and felt something close to the exact thing he'd sworn he wouldn't let himself feel. The same helplessness he remembered standing next to his father at that long-ago auction, watching something worth saving slip past the point where effort could still fix it. The land doesn't die, his father used to say. It just waits on somebody patient enough to remember it. Caleb had believed that sentence for 4 years without ever once being tested on it. Standing in the flooded orchard, he understood it might be about to fail him the same way it had failed his father. He pulled the map from the truck, rain already soaking its edges, and studied it one more time by the gray afternoon light. The main channel was clear enough. The orchard was easy to place. But near the western edge, several faint lines ran off toward the lower pasture, lines he'd noticed before and never fully understood. He folded the map and started walking, rain blurring the ground under his boots, following a hunch instead of a clear plan for the first time since he'd bought the property. An hour into the search, half frozen and coated in mud past his knees, he found it. A second channel, older and shallower than the main one, built specifically to carry overflow away from the orchard during exactly this kind of storm. Someone, the Whitakers, decades before, had already solved this problem. It had simply been buried too long for anyone to remember it existed. He cleared it by hand in the failing light, and within 20 minutes the standing water around the orchard began to visibly recede, pulled off toward the lower field the way it had been designed to go 100 years earlier. The trees that had started leaning didn't fall. The fence would need rebuilding, but the orchard held. Caleb sat on the tailgate that night, soaked through, hands raw, and let himself feel something he hadn't let himself feel since the day of his father's auction. Not triumph exactly, but proof. Proof that patience aimed at the right thing eventually paid for itself. His father had never gotten that proof. Caleb finally had. The reprieve didn't last long. 3 weeks later, a county notice arrived by certified mail. A proposed access road, connecting the county line to a new development tract farther uphill, was slated to run directly through the western third of Caleb's property, through the orchard, through the second channel he'd just spent a flooded afternoon uncovering, close enough to the farmhouse foundation to threaten it during construction. To the county, the 52 acres were still, on paper, exactly what they'd always been, undeveloped land, and used, unremarkable. Nothing in their record said otherwise. Caleb sat in his truck with the notice on the dash for a long time before he drove to Ray's place. Ray read it twice, then looked up. County'll get that road through regardless of what you think of it. Unless you can give them a real reason not to run it there. You need more than an opinion, Caleb. You're going to need proof. The next morning Ray showed up before Caleb had finished the goats, carrying a cardboard box and a thermos of coffee that looked like it had survived several decades of ranch work itself. He didn't joke about the property this time. He told Caleb that his grandfather had kept boxes of old farm papers in the attic, saved by Ray's mother because she'd never been able to throw out anything connected to the old families of the valley. Near the bottom of the box, Ray found a photograph that stopped them both cold. It showed the same farmhouse foundation, except in the photograph the house was still standing, porch running the length of the front, apple trees visible behind it, a man standing beside the porch rail with the open, maintained pasture stretching out behind him. On the back, in fading pencil, a year, a note about apples and vegetables and livestock raised on less than 60 acres even through dry years that had hurt every farm around it. Below that, a second line, a spring that had never once failed, and a lower field that could be deliberately flooded when summer turned too dry. The lower field, Caleb said, understanding at last exactly what the second channel he'd cleared in the storm had actually been for. Ray nodded. His grandfather had always said the Whitakers understood that land better than anyone else in the valley, and that everything fell apart once the people who understood it were gone. Caleb looked at the photograph, then out at his own restored orchard, and the whole shape of it finally closed in his mind. The goats hadn't just cleared weeds. They'd uncovered a working system built by people who'd understood water, shade, timing, and soil well enough to make 60 acres outproduce farms twice its size. The map wasn't just a record of where things had stood. It was a record of how the farm had actually worked. The county hearing was held the following Thursday in a small municipal building that smelled like old carpet and coffee that had sat too long on the burner. Caleb arrived early with the map in a protective folder, the photograph beside it, and a stack of dated photographs documenting every stage of what he and the goats had uncovered. Ray was already in the parking lot when Caleb pulled in, leaning against his own truck the same way he had the day he'd first called Caleb a fool outside the feed store. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little." "Good. Means you understand what's actually riding on it." Ray pushed off the truck and fell into step beside him. "For what it's worth, I wasn't planning on speaking today. Wasn't sure it was my place. But I got to thinking about my granddad slowing that truck down every time we passed this way, never once explaining why, like the not knowing was something he'd made peace with a long time ago." He shook his head. Didn't feel right, letting that die quiet a second time. "So I'm speaking." Caleb didn't have anything to say to that beyond a nod, but it settled something in his chest walking through the door, the specific, steadying knowledge that he wasn't about to argue this alone. A county planner named Otis Beale opened the session, laying out the case for the access road in the flat, reasonable tone of a man who'd never once framed himself as the villain of anyone's story. The road would connect two growth corridors. It would benefit 3 neighboring properties. According to county records, the Mercer parcel showed no current agricultural use and no structures of recorded historical value. "Mr. Mercer," the county commissioner said, "you're welcome to speak." Caleb stood. He didn't tell them that people had laughed at him for buying the land. He didn't tell them he'd been right. He opened the folder and set the old photograph on the table first. "This is the Whitaker farmhouse," he said. "Standing, in this photograph, on the same foundation stones your road is proposed to cross." He set the map beside it. "This is the original farm layout, spring, water channels, orchard, farmhouse, and a lower field engineered specifically to flood during drought. I didn't draw this. I found it buried on the property in a tin box that had been in the ground since before any of us were born." Beale leaned forward. "How can you be certain these channels are actually connected to what you're calling a historical water system, and not simply erosion?" "Because I nearly lost my orchard to a storm in October," Caleb said. "And the only reason I didn't was an old channel this map led me to, built by people who'd already solved the exact problem I was standing in the middle of. I have photographs of the flood, photographs of the repair, and a neighbor," he nodded toward Ray, "sitting near the back, whose grandfather remembered this farm operating for decades before any of us were alive. This isn't erosion. It's engineering. It's just been buried long enough that the county forgot to look for it. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when an argument that sounded thin a minute earlier suddenly doesn't. One commissioner asked to see the photograph again. A man near the front stood before anyone could move on. A developer's representative named Kurt Sanders. There on behalf of the uphill track the road was meant to serve. With respect, he said, a photograph and a hand-drawn map aren't a survey. The county's had this parcel logged as in used agricultural land for decades. My client has permits pending on a timeline that a review process could delay by a year or more. And that's a real cost to real people, not a hypothetical one. It's not hypothetical to me either, Caleb said. I've got the receipts for every dollar I put into that orchard, and photographs dated the same week as the flood that nearly took it. If your client's timeline depends on nobody ever finding out what's actually on this land, that's not my problem to solve for him. Nobody's disputing you found something interesting, Sanders said. I'm asking whether interesting rises to the level of stopping a permitted road. The commissioner cut in before Caleb could answer. That's exactly why we're not voting today, Mr. Sanders. Mr. Mercer's brought physical evidence and a corroborating witness. Your client's timeline doesn't get to override a review just because it's inconvenient. She turned back to Caleb. Is there anyone else who can speak to the property's history, besides Mr. Dillard? Ray stood without being asked twice. My grandfather talked about the Whitaker farm my whole childhood. I didn't think much of it till I found his old photograph myself, 3 weeks back, in a box my mother never got around to throwing out. Delia Mercer in town can tell you the same history firsthand. She's old enough to remember the farm running. The commissioner made a note. We'll want her statement on record before any final decision. She looked at Sanders, whose expression had gone carefully neutral. This board isn't in the business of paving over history because a permit's on a clock. We'll take it under advisement. They didn't vote that day. What followed instead was nearly 2 months of uncertainty that turned out to be its own kind of test. County staff visited the property twice to document the foundation and channels. Delia gave a formal statement corroborating Ray's account, and Sanders' client, according to secondhand word passed through the feed store, quietly explored whether the road could simply be rerouted around the dispute entirely rather than wait out a historical review that had no guaranteed outcome. Caleb spent those 2 months finishing what he could of the restoration without knowing whether any of it would ultimately survive a bulldozer. Some days that felt like exactly the wrong way to spend the time. Most days it felt like the only honest way to spend it. The land didn't stop needing attention just because its legal fate was undecided, and Caleb had learned enough from his father's story to know that waiting anxiously never once changed an outcome that patient work might still influence. The final letter came in December, longer and more formal than the first. The county's historical review board had determined the Whitaker farmstead met the threshold for local historical designation, based on the physical evidence, the corroborating testimony, and photographs establishing continuous documentation of the site's agricultural significance. The proposed road corridor was permanently rerouted along the parcel's eastern boundary instead, avoiding the orchard, the farmhouse foundation, and both water channels entirely. Nobody from the county called to congratulate him. Caleb didn't need them to. Word moved slowly through Cedar Hollow after that, the way it always did. A little talk at the feed store, a little more at the diner, until most of the valley knew some version of what had been sitting under 52 acres nobody had wanted. A few people came out just to look. Fewer still came with real questions. Ray was the first to actually try the method himself, running a small trial herd of goats on a stretch of his own overgrown ground he'd spent years treating as a lost cause. Months later, sitting on Caleb's tailgate, he admitted the goats had cleared in a season what he'd assumed would take a bulldozer and money he didn't have. He didn't stop there. By the following spring he'd bought 6 goats of his own, and the two men fell into a habit of comparing notes at the feed store the same way they'd once traded doubts. Ray asking about fencing, Caleb asking whether Ray had found anything worth digging for underneath his own tangled acres. The answer came that June. Ray called him on a Saturday morning, and the first thing Caleb noticed was that Ray, usually the driest man in the county, sounded almost like a kid on the other end of the line. His goats had cleared a stretch near his back property line that had been fenced off and ignored since before he'd bought the place. And underneath the brush his own shovel had found something that clinked instead of thudded. Old well casing, Ray said, when Caleb drove out to see it. Hand dug, capped with a stone lid same as yours. My granddaddy's initials are scratched into the side of it." He stood there a while, looking down at it, the same way Caleb remembered standing over the tin box 8 months earlier. "Guess I never really believed you until I found my own." Caleb didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. Some lessons only really land once a man finds the proof standing on his own ground. Delia Mercer came out to see the farmhouse foundation herself that autumn, driven by her granddaughter, moving slowly across ground that had once been entirely familiar to her as a girl. She stood at the edge of the orchard for a long while, looking at rows that had finally begun bearing fruit again after decades of neglect, and when Caleb asked what she was thinking, she just said, "Ezra would have liked knowing somebody finally listened." She didn't explain further, and she didn't need to. Caleb didn't build a company out of any of it. He didn't get famous. He kept working the land, the way his father used to say a man should, patiently, and for its own sake rather than for what it might turn into. The farmhouse was eventually rebuilt on the original foundation, using as much of the old stonework as could safely be reused, facing the orchard exactly the way the Whitakers had once built it to face. Caleb did most of the work himself. Evenings and weekends stretched across 2 full years, learning masonry from a retired stonemason 2 counties over the same patient way he'd once learned to read the land itself. The spring basin stayed where it had always been. The channels were restored by hand rather than replaced with modern pipe, because Caleb had learned, the hard way, in a flood that nearly cost him the orchard, that the old design had already solved problems he hadn't even known to anticipate. People still called it the Dead Acres sometimes, telling the story of how it used to look. Nobody said it like a joke anymore. Years later, Caleb stood at the same spot on the county road where he'd first watched 14 goats disappear into weeds taller than a man. The farmhouse stood where the tangle had been. The orchard ran down the slope in clean, recognizable rows. Somewhere under the grass, water still moved exactly where the Whitakers had once decided it should go. He took his father's old feed truck logbook out of the glove box, the one thing of Wendell's he still kept close, its cover soft with age, and set it on the dash beside the photograph Ray's grandfather had saved, the one showing a man standing at a porch rail on ground that had once looked exactly like this again. His father had never gotten his 40 acres back. He died still saying the land was waiting on somebody, without ever quite believing he'd be the one it was waiting for. Caleb understood now that his father had been right about the sentence, just wrong about who it applied to. The land hadn't been waiting on Wendell Mercer specifically. It had been waiting on anyone patient enough to come back and look. Anyone willing to let 14 goats do the slow, unglamorous work of proving that neglect and worthlessness were never actually the same thing. He put the logbook back in the glove box, checked the fence, and went to move the herd to the next section, because there was still work to do, the way there always would be, and because his father had taught him, even in failing to prove it himself, that the work was never really the hard part. The hard part was believing the land was still worth it before anyone else agreed with you. If you've ever looked at something everyone else had written off and wondered whether there was something worth saving underneath it, tell me about it in the comments. Those are exactly the stories I want to hear. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten land, quiet perseverance, and the things people find when they refuse to give up too soon, subscribe for more.